I actually really want to talk about this kindly, but when it comes to the conversation of Indigenous peoples across North America, including Canada and the United States, especially with what just happened with Beyonce, I think to accurately have this conversation, you have to have had decolonized a little bit, or at least understand the concept of decolonization. But when we talk about North America, when we think about the size, right, the land mass, how big it is, and then you think of the fact that, like, when we reference Indigenous people, it's generally what you hear people say is just Indigenous people as like a blanket statement. It groups all these people together, but that really happened because of the Canadian government and the US government. And a lot of people, when they refer to you not looking Indigenous enough, a lot of the times it's because they're only used to the caricatures that exist within media, especially when it comes to, like, you'll always hear people like, oh, you're a Cherokee princess. And it's because the only frame of reference they have for Indigenous people is Cherokees that are represented in media. But those Indigenous people are not the only Indigenous people. That's why when people look at me and say, you're white presenting, I am white presenting, but there's a lot of features I have in my face and just me in general that is Indigenous, but it's not Cherokee Indigenous. Now, if colonization did not happen, you look at the landmass of Canada, you look at the landmass of the United States, it would be safe to say if Indigenous people had gone the same way of Europe, of like establishing countries, North America, like Canada and US, would be far more than just two countries. Because when we think about Europe, Europe is significantly smaller in size, but we have so many different countries and nationalities within Europe. Like if you're talking about white people, like you have Irish people, you have Ukrainian people, you have British people, but the reality, like there's the generalization of like white people that encompasses so many people, even when you talk about Europeans. But when it comes to Indigenous people, there's no way, like no one in the world really knows the amount of types of Indigenous people that exist, how many bands, how many cultures exist within Indigenous groups. So for example, like I'm Anishinaabe, which is like, when you look at it, it's a bigger group of people, but within Anishinaabe, I'm Ojibwe. That's its own community. Now, had North America and the United States not been colonized, you might have seen countries that established themselves differently, because when we look at like Indigenous culture back then, there was a lot of people, a lot of communities that had established where their area was, even though they might have been nomadic. Some weren't nomadic, they lived in longhouses, and the ones that were nomadic still stayed within like certain areas based upon the makeup of the land. Like you have, you know, Lake Superior is the deepest, biggest lake that exists. You weren't crossing that in a longboat, you know what I mean? So they were, which is where I'm from, in that area, and they were nomadic, they moved around, but they didn't generally, you know, they're not going to cross a great like Lake Superior. You still have, you know, tankers that have a hard time doing that. So to say that these Indigenous groups within Alberta, these Indigenous groups within BC, these Indigenous groups in Saskatchewan, they need to come together, and as you said, there's like 138 bands in Alberta, it's like not very realistic to expect 138 individual nations to see things the exact same way, dependent upon their location. Some like an Indigenous band that maybe exists in southern Alberta is not going to feel the same as an Indigenous band who maybe exists in northern Alberta, dependent upon all these things. So to say that you just want one person, one chief to represent all of those bands is very colonizing mindset, because it's forcing Indigenous people to take on the same system that already exists within Canada, as opposed to the system that Indigenous people had prior to colonization. Indigenous people were very good at self-governing, and that's what should be worked towards because of the treaties. The treaties were signed with specific bands, specific reserves, and those are important when considering the groups of people, because those treaties designate Indigenous people. It is a nation-to-nation agreement, meaning these Indigenous bands, these nations, are viewed as nations, not as small fringe groups. And the only reason that these groups would be small at this point in time is due to the cultural, genocide and unaliving that happened within residential schools. Now, that unaliving only stopped in residential schools in the 90s, but has continued through CPS. We just saw there was a news article where it was 12 Indigenous children were found unalived under the care of CPS. Then you take into consideration missing and murdered Indigenous women. There's a large group of women there that are not accounted for in the unaliving rapes because they're just considered missing and they're not looked for. Then you take into account that a lot of Indigenous women will go in for health care and they will be sterilized without their consent, without their knowledge, to dwindle the population down. So the mindset you have around Indigenous communities is exactly the mindset that has kind of been forced upon Indigenous communities, to think it's the only way forward, because it's exactly what the powers that be specifically want right now. And I don't know about you, but 150 years of putting up a fight to try and get what was promised, what was legally documented and signed, I don't think that's worth giving up. Especially when they went so far as to make it illegal for Indigenous people to seek lawyers. And now we're finally at a point in time where Indigenous people can seek lawyers, which is why we're finally seeing lawsuits against the Canadian government. And the only reason I brought up Beyonce is because everything going on with Beyonce, a lot of people have brought up the fact that there were Indigenous nations that had slaves. There was five in total that had slaves. Horrible. Don't agree with them. Don't think it was right. I think that should never be forgotten. I don't think it should be brushed under the rug. But 5 out of thousands. Like in the States, they have thousands of nations. So the same way that I wouldn't say that Irish people are guilty of British crimes, I wouldn't say that every Indigenous nation is guilty of every other Indigenous nation's crimes, because they are in fact different people. Like culturally, historically, in the context of who they are as a group of people, British people, Irish people have a different history.